Hello, I'm David Reilly, and very warm welcome to today's edition of People and Politics. If you've not already done so, please consider subscribing to the show. I'd be very grateful indeed. Or if you're feeling super generous, you could buy me a cup of coffee by following the link in the channel description. I'm very much looking forward to today's discussion because I'm joined by my local MSP, Paul McLennan, and we're going to be talking about some of the issues that are affecting people right here in East Lothian and, of course, right across Scotland. So, without further ado, welcome to People and Politics. Paul McLennan, thank you very much for taking the time to come on the podcast. It's really good to meet you again. Thank you.
Good to see you, David.
Good.
Glad to be on.
So I hope you're enjoying the summertime, and of course Parliament's in recess at the moment. I think you start back the end of August. So I wonder if you could tell me what are some of the priorities for the next term of Parliament and government, and how they will affect people in East Lothian here.
I think in East Lothian there's probably a number of things. One obviously is always about making sure that we tackle poverty. That's always got to be one of my key priorities. There's prosperity in East Lothian, but there's also areas of multiple deprivation in East Lothian as well. So I think that's important. So how we tackle that, that's, for example, the child poverty, and I think the child payment helps that in terms of that as well. I think that's really important. Obviously, creating more jobs in East Lothian is really important. Traditionally, our job density, the number of people that work in East Lothian and stay in East Lothian, is lower than most of Scotland because some people go work in Edinburgh. So creating more jobs, I think, is really important in terms of that as well. So, and obviously, housing is a big issue as well. I was previously a housing minister, and we're building lots of houses in East Lothian, but we've got to make sure that there's that fair number comes through as affordable housing as well. So they're two or three of the big priorities in terms of that. Government, I think, is similar in terms of tackling poverty, creating economic opportunities as well in terms of that. And we know that East Lothian has an issue and still going on about car parking. That was still an issue during the election, and will continue to be so at the moment as well. So, but so some of the key priorities. There's lots of other things, but I think they're the key priorities that come through for me.
That I'm sure I read somewhere, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm sure I read that the biggest expanse of housing going up in East Lothian compared to most other parts of Scotland. So it's quite ironic that we have the biggest housing growth, but some of the most static economic rates.
East Lothian and Mid Lothian are probably around about the same about the number of houses being built, and that's good for East Lothian and Mid Lothian because even if it's private developments, 25% of these private developments have to be affordable housing. So obviously, more houses we build, then obviously 25% of these come through as affordable housing. So that's good in a way. The council's obviously building its own stock as well. So, but we know the cost of construction, for example, has gone up massively in the last 2 or 3 years because of inflation. It's gone up by about a third. So a house, in £200,000 house, for example, would cost about an extra £50,000-60,000 to build as it did a few years ago. So that becomes a challenge. Another long-term challenge we have is obviously the sell-off of council housing a number of years ago. Obviously took 8,000 houses out of East Lothian. So obviously these need to be replaced as well. So that's a long-term, when it went up to the to stop the right to buy, and I think that was the right decision at the time. So, but East Lothian's it's in terms of housing, it's still got its demands, but it's building a lot of houses as well. So.
Well, I don't think it created less 8,000 less homes. It just changed the ownership of the homes.
Yeah, it does, and I think one of the
That's
key
a
things.
whole other argument.
Yeah, and I suppose, well, the key thing as well when you're talking about
Same
housing,
number of people, same number of homes.
yeah, but when you're talking about housing, what was really important, and in terms of when I was a minister as well, what was really important is the turnover in housing, in terms of that, because obviously when it was council housing stock, then it was turned over after a certain period of time. If the turnover for housing stock isn't as quick, and then obviously that makes a difference. So you're seeing that right across Scotland, as there is in England as well. People are living longer, for example, in
Yeah.
Scotland than in England. So that turnover wasn't as prevalent as it was before when it was council housing stock. So that's been demonstrated right across East Lothian, Scotland, the rest of the UK and Europe in terms of that. So
Well, one thing that I'd like to pick up on is a bit earlier you said that you're keen to increase jobs in East Lothian
yeah,
and economic rates. But in the last 12 months, the local government pulled the funding for vital support for East Lothian works, so disabled people like me don't get extra support to get into work. And when I had that fitted with your goal for creating jobs in East Lothian.
yeah. I think in terms of obviously the government passes its budget on, and you'll recall, I mean, I was a councillor for 15 years and a council leader in East Lothian, so obviously know how the budget system works. It was very much along the lines of government obviously passes it on to, it passes funding on to the local government. Local government makes its own decisions in terms of what it does. East Lothian Works is still funded. There are various other initiatives in terms of that. So the council obviously makes its own decisions in terms of its own budget. In terms of that, so again, that's down to where and quite rightly, because when I was council and council leader, you had that flexibility to decide where you spent the money, and government doesn't decide that. And I think for me, I was on the social justice committee at the parliament, and one of the key things we looked into around about that was in terms of getting people back into work or supporting people into work, and organisations such as East Lothian Works and so on were vital in terms of doing that for obvious people with disabilities, but also, for example, people who needed that additional childcare or so on as well was really important to get people back into work. So that decision is made by the council. But again, that's something that I wouldn't support that going ahead. So, and again, that's something I discuss with the council on a regular basis.
Uh, okay, I'm going to come back to that issue in a while because I wanted to talk about the interface between the Scottish Government and the Council, because as you know, there's a lot of really unhappy people, particularly in North Berwick, about parking charges. I'm wondering if you could start with tell me um, your position on the parking charges and the SNP position on the parking charges.
Well, there's two key things. Obviously, in terms of the decision that's made by the council itself, that's entirely up to each council. In terms of that, my position right from the outset from this was pretty clear. I was at public meetings in Dunbar and in Haddington, and the key concerns I had at the time, and this was on public record and other recordings, that there was no indication of cost, there was no indication of how much money it would raise. There was no modelling done on terms of would it reduce traffic, would it reduce footfall on High Street, for example, and would it reduce emissions? And I asked, it was John McMillan in Northern Hampshire at the time, and they were asked at the meeting and by myself, could they provide that? And they said no. And I think that was one of the key things that I can't support a scheme that I don't know much now. In Dunbar, North Berwick, and Haddington, it's estimated to raise £20,000 a year only between the three of them. The consultation cost £800,000. So I met with the traders prior to that. I met with the community councils, Dunbar, Haddington, and North Berwick also in that regard, and spoke to them. And I continue to meet with them in terms of that. And just a few days ago, the council chief executive met with North Berwick traders in the meeting I had arranged. So my position has always been clear that it's not something I've supported. The consultation process itself was terrible, absolutely terrible in terms of that. Now, the SNP group it decided that they would support the car parking with some, obviously, mitigations, obviously looking at reviews and so on. And obviously that was voted down by the administration at that particular stage. Now, one of the key things I think for me is, particularly about North Berwick, when I visited the traders after the car parking came in, they said that they were experienced a drop off in trade. So I arranged a meeting with the council in terms of that, and hence why we've got the meeting with the chief executive and the traders in terms of that. So. And the lessons for me from that, David, was I remember when coastal car parking came in, it was a Labour administration, it brought it in. It lost around about £1 million over 3 or 4 years because they hadn't properly costed that at the very outset. So this wasn't, for me, just a political decision. It was based on experience with the coastal car parking charges. The coastal car parking charges now washes its face, but for about 3 or 4 years, it lost around about £1 million cumulatively over that time because they didn't estimate that properly. Hence why my opposition to the car parking was prevalent right at the start and continues to be the same. And it was the same during the elections in May as well.
So if it's costing so much money and it is only going to raise, say 20,000, which would be like, why are the council going ahead of it? Because local residents are asking questions, for example, they want to know what problems it's going to affect or what problems the council is going to affect because not bad. Busy right now, it's the middle of summer, the sun's out, but come to September, October, there is no parking problem, and you mentioned earlier in the call that, one of the key priorities for the Scottish government to come is eating the cost of living, poverty, hardship, but they're putting on this other tax onto local residents. And it doesn't sound like a bit of joint not thinking to me.
No, it's not, and I think that's obviously in the election campaign, the First Minister visited North Berwick and heard directly from the shopkeepers in terms of that, and it's been raised in Parliament as well. Obviously, it's purely a local government decision, and I've made my position clear on that. In terms of joined up thinking, you're correct, and one of the key things, fundamentals for me, is if you're going to make changes to car parking or make changes to anything that the Dunbar Council does, it needs to have a proper consultation with the people it's going to impact. And one of my biggest concerns all the way through this was it didn't have any consultation at all with the traders, or the community councils, or the public more generally. It tended to be, we're going to be bringing this forward and we'll bring forward the scheme later on. So they said they would bring it forward, but with no real details. And the public meetings in Dunbar and Haddington demonstrated that they didn't know what the cost of bringing it in, or the cost it would raise, the money it would raise, or anything else around about how it would reduce traffic. Without doing that, they should have had that in place, discussed it with the traders, designed a scheme with the traders and community council, and done that. It's not left the council in very good light because. And I think obviously they're bringing in a scheme in Trinent and Musselburgh as well. They're proposing to bring in a scheme at Trinent and Musselburgh. Now, Musselburgh is completely different to North Berwick and Dunbar and Haddington because the size of it. So that's where they think they'll make most of the money from. But it's not been very well thought out at all. And I think that was the main concern for me, that it was a very poorly thought out scheme.
I understand what you're saying about it's a local government decision and not for the Scottish Parliament. But what influence are you willing to bear on it? Because sure you must have some means of exercising influence over it as a local.
I think there's a number of things. One, obviously, is listening to people first and foremost. I said I've met with the traders and the community councils in Dunbar, Haddington, North Berwick on a number of occasions, and just to visit the traders in North Berwick probably about a month to 6 weeks ago. Hence, then why we got a meeting with the chief executive of the council, which was just held during the week. In terms of that, and I made my position clear in terms of leaflets for the election, in terms of speaking to people on the doors. I know, having been a councillor for 15 years, then it's a decision that the council makes. I can make my position clear, as I do on various other issues. For example, there was change to nursery hours in North Berwick area as well, which didn't suit parents. We met with parents over a number of occasions, arranged meetings with the council on that issue as well, and can continue to do that, obviously, with constituents on a number of issues, whether it's education or a council kind of services. So I mean, I can try and make that case for that, as I continue to do so for the parking. But it's a local government decision, and I think that's important to recognise that the independence of local government in terms of where national government kind of comes in, because if national government tried to interfere too much, council and councillors would push back on that. So I try and use my influence as best as I possibly can, and that would be the same as any MSP in any part of Scotland or England. It's an MP in terms of that they can try and influence council decisions, but that's a decision for councillors. Now, if people aren't happy with decisions that the councillors have made, as it is with myself, then we have elections coming up in May where they can obviously make their views known in terms of that, as they could have done with me last May as well. So, and that's politics. But there's got to be that clear definition between what councillors do and what MSPs do. I can try and get my influence there, but it's not, that's as far as it goes. But it's engaging with the community, I think, is something that I can do as best as I possibly can.
Would you be able and willing to demand a pause to the scheme so far until there's a proper review? Because, as you said, it has been introduced, but there was a scrutiny,
David, I've already asked for a pause. When I last met the traders, we both issued a press release on that after we met, because that's what the traders were asking for. That's what I was asking for. So there was a press release went out. I had an article in the Courier, East Lothian Courier, saying the same thing. I wrote to the council in terms of that as well. And on my own social media, I called for a pause as well. So that's something that I was working in conjunction with the traders and community council on. So I've already called that, and I've already said to that, and we'll continue to support that until the council will have a proper look at this. Now, the council didn't say it was going to have a pause. Part of the discussion that led to the meeting with the chief executive was in calling for that pause. They came back and said, look, we'll meet with the traders to have that discussion around about how we can improve the scheme. So they didn't pause it, but the traders, I arranged a meeting with the traders and the chief executive, and then that was just on during the week. So, but yeah, coming back to the point, it was a poorly thought out scheme, and they seem to be working backwards in this. It seems to be okay, let's try and fix it before it was, when it was brought in, it wasn't well thought out at all. So, but I continue to liaise with the traders, the community council, and the council on this issue. And I just met with the council chief executive on Tuesday and raised the same issue with them again in terms of that. So they know that they should have done better with this. And, so hence the key things are making sure that the traders, community council and the council are talking to each other on a regular basis. And that's something I'll encourage them to do.
Well, that's all we can ask because, there's all the anger about it, and I think one of my fears is, at the moment we've got some very nice independent gift shops and bookshops here in hand of me, once they bring in the chat, the packaging chat, these shops will disappear, they will go, and when a pound land will get a hole in the ballot, and when they get loads of other shops to sell time, because people will know.
No, and you're right, David. I mean,
and I think that what it is, I would only, one of the key priorities that the Scottish government and the SNP pride themselves on is tackling the cost of living, and they all blame that on the South and the banking crisis and Westminster, but people already pay slightly higher tax here in Scotland, and this is another tax going on to businesses.
David, a few things.
And it makes no sense at all. It's nothing to do with the South. The Scottish government are putting that tax onto local people. And you can understand why they're so angry.
Yeah, well, first of all, the car parking charge is a decision purely for the Labour-controlled council, so that's a decision. In terms of the point you mentioned about tax, 55% of people in Scotland pay less tax, and I think that's an important point to mention. I would pay slightly more tax. I pay more tax in Scotland than I would if I was down in England. I think it's all around about value for money and what people pay in Scotland. My kids, as well as lots of other kids, had free tuition. Now, my kids wouldn't have gone to university. I didn't, in terms of that. Obviously, there's free prescriptions. In terms of that, another one of the key things for tackling poverty as well, there is a Scottish child payment, which it isn't in other parts of Scotland. Now, there are 8,000 children in 8,000 families, 8,000 children in East Lothian alone receive the Scottish child payment. So that makes a massive difference to people in East Lothian in terms of that. They don't have that down in England or in Wales or the Northern Ireland. They have the ability to do that if they chose to do so. They choose not to do that. So that's how, and one of the key measurements, for example, if you're talking about poverty, in Scotland, child poverty is 10% lower in Scotland than it is in the rest of the UK. And falling, and I think that's a key point. That in terms of that. And if you speak to poverty,
so does that mean the Scottish Parliament have got the power to reduce child poverty? Because if it's falling, that means that the Scottish Parliament must be bringing it down, which means that they've got the power to that. So
in terms of the
why
child
is it
payment,
only gone down 10%, considering they've been in power for 20 years?
yeah.
Why do we to, they've
Well,
either got the power or not?
David, in terms of the Scottish child payment, obviously that's something that the Scottish Government chose to do, and that's part of devolution. If you look at the rest of the UK, child poverty is going up. Child poverty is going up, so that's an issue in terms of they haven't made that choice. One of the other key things as well in terms of energy, for example, is energy costs in Scotland are some of the highest energy costs in Europe. We have no ability around about the price of gas or electricity, and that's one of the biggest contributors. Yet we produce, and you just have to look off the coast of East Lothian, where we have the wind farm that's there, and in terms of what we have no ability to lower energy costs because it's a reserved issue in terms of, and I will always ask for the right for Scotland to make its own decisions particularly around about energy. So when it does make its decisions, for example, around about the child payment, you see child payment dropping in Scotland and rising in other parts of the UK. So that's the comparison in terms of the powers that we have. If we had more powers, for example, over energy, we would have lower energy costs. Scotland has the highest energy costs in Europe, and yet we're one of the biggest producers in terms of energy. And only in Dunbar at the moment you will see.
But you've refused to dig in the North Sea. You've ruled out nuclear. You've ruled out more digging in the UK, and you think building windmills is going to bring down our energy costs, and that can at least be on to.
David, I think there's an important point again to make sure that you listeners to this are Scotland produces 115% of the electricity that it actually needs. So we produce as much electricity as we need in terms of that. So we produce more electricity than we have, yet we still pay more than that. So we produce more electricity in terms of that. The decision about oil and gas isn't something that the Scottish Government can take. That's a reserved issue. That's a reserved issue in terms of the UK Government. Again, we don't have powers that. But coming back to the point you mentioned about the power, we produce 115% electricity more than we actually need. And again, but we don't have powers over the regulation of that. The costs are based on gas. They're based on the costs of gas. So if we had similar energy policies to other parts of Europe where energy costs are much lower, for example, in Denmark, our energy costs would be lower. But we don't have the power to change the costs of how energy prices are regulated, and that was one of the main issues that was discussed in the government elections was about the cost of living. And again, that comes back. And one of the key things the SNP were saying is about we have all the energy, but we don't have the power to lower the costs in terms of that. We produce more than we need, yet because of the system is based on the price of gas in the UK, we don't have that advantage of seeing our energy prices being lower, because when you look at other parts of Europe, energy prices are much lower. And so that is the cost. That is the cost of the UK energy policy to people in Scotland. We shouldn't have to pay more, but we do currently because the system is designed not to help people in that regard.
Wind energy. I'm aware you're about to build a massive energy bank at an enforced called Berwick Bank, and that's been absolutely spoken against by environmental agencies. Apparently, the site 4,000 seabirds at risk. The Scottish seabird, that doesn't sound too good for the environment. But at the same time, the Scottish government have ruled out nuclear, and we've got Torness there that said this well for 50 years. It creates a lot of jobs, it supplies a lot of Scottish energy, but you said we won't do any more.
Well, again, David, coming back to there's a few important points in terms of that. At the moment, we produce 115% more energy than we need, and that would still be the case even if Torness decides to close in around about 3 or 4 years' time in terms of that. So I think that's an important thing. I think in terms of the number of jobs, there's around about 400 or 500 jobs that are there. There was just a report out just a few weeks ago by the CBI that reported that East Lothian is one of the highest areas in employment for green energy. There's about 1,500 people employed in the green energy sector in East Lothian alone, and that will continue to grow. And the cost of nuclear, what they call the strike price of nuclear, is higher than it is of renewables. So the actual price of nuclear to produce nuclear is higher than it is for renewables. So there's a number of reasons why in terms of, so Torness will continue to the end of its natural life, and that's Scottish government policy. But we already produce more electricity than we need at the moment. In terms of that, the important point about this comes back to the regulation. The regulation of prices are controlled by the UK government, and yet we still see the highest energy costs in Europe, and that shouldn't be the case because we're one of the biggest energy producers in the whole of Europe in terms of that. People in Scotland should benefit from that. We don't, and that's something I will continue to campaign for, that we have the price of energy is regulated in Scotland, not down in the UK Parliament.
Okay, I wanted to move on now, but there's one thing you said earlier I wanted to challenge you on.
Yeah.
You said that child poverty is increasing, and that's not entirely true because the Labour government have just lifted the millions of children into poverty by releasing that cap. And after 20 years of government of the SNP in Scotland to say that child poverty is 10% lower, as a pretty dismal record. And
no, David, I have to challenge. I have to challenge back on that particular point. The Scottish government, when the two-child cap it was raised, that was because of pressure from the Scottish government, and the Scottish government had set funds aside to do that, to scrap the two-child cap in Scotland. The UK government, under pressure, only just done that because the Scottish government were going to fund that in terms of this. I'm proud of the record. We all want to eradicate child poverty, but because of the investment we have through that, then that's one of the issues that I think that we need to continue to drive on. But the child poverty is higher in the UK and has continued to rise. The two-child cap that's just been raised has just been in the case of an announcement in the last number of weeks. That will take time to work through. Because we've had the Scottish Child Payment in place for a number of years, you're seeing child poverty continue to drop in terms of that. Now, there's other influences on child poverty, and I've met child poverty organisations in terms of this. Part is this coming back to the point we just talked around about, for example, on energy costs. And having met families, lots of families in terms of that in East Lothian a number of years, the biggest cost they were facing was energy costs, as well as food costs. And that's inflation. So child poverty is something, but I am proud of the record because if you look in terms of where child poverty is in Scotland, it is much lower than it is in the rest of the UK. Much lower.
But don't you care about poverty levels of children? Yeah, everywhere. I care about children in poverty in the inner city of Manchester, Birmingham, every bit as much as I
David,
care as the people in
of course I do. Of course I do.
But you're saying, but you wear it like a bad thing. We're better, it's lower.
No, David,
it's quite shameful, really.
No, well, David, I would fundamentally disagree with that because politics is all about choice. Politics is all about choice. The UK government, the Scottish government chose to begin the Scottish Child Payment. The UK government chose not to. Now, this comes back to the whole purpose of devolution and ultimately independence. The Scottish government chose to prioritise tackling child poverty. The UK government chose not to. I want to see child poverty eradicated. And just as you said, in other cities of London or Birmingham or Manchester or any other parts in the UK, the UK government have that choice. Have that choice now to bring in a Scottish Child Payment or the equivalent of a Scottish Child Payment in the UK. They have that choice. They have chosen not to do that. The Scottish government chose to do that. Now, the Welsh government is now talking about introducing something similar to the Scottish government in terms of that. We had that choice, and the people of Scotland, in terms of the recent election, put faith in the SNP again for a fifth term. But we had that choice, and we made that choice. The UK government now could bring in the equivalent of a child payment if they wanted to right now, and they choose not to. But that's their political decision, the political decision that we made in Scotland. And the Scottish Child Payment, you will see, is backed by every single party in the Scottish Parliament. It's not an SNP policy. It's backed by every single party in the Scottish Parliament because it's recognised as a real, I suppose, benefit to the people, to the children in Scotland. So we have that choice. The UK government have that choice right now to do that. They choose not to at the moment.
Okay. Can we move on to another subject that I wanted to take the opportunity to talk about? And this is changing subject. The proposed new data centre in the Lammermuir Hills. What do you know about that, and what's your stance on that?
On the data centre in the Lammermuirs, I had a meeting with the group. It's not in East Lothian, in terms of that. So it's just over the border. In terms of that, I spoke to the group who are against that, and it's actually I think it's the Roxburgh Estate that are bringing it forward. So I've not seen the details. I've asked them for full details because obviously there's a number of key things. One is what the size of it is. Two is what is its energy use and its water usage. And three, what is its end use? In terms of that, there are a few other data centres being looked at in East Lothian that aren't in terms of that as well. But the key things, and I've written to the Scottish Government on this in terms of this, AI strategy is a reserved matter. So in terms of the use of AI and whatever, it's reserved to the UK Government. In terms of planning, the planning is obviously it's the local authority that decides on planning. In terms of this, I had a meeting with the council just last week talking about data centres. So they will look at where it's based. Is it looking at, for example, and key material planning considerations, for example, is it is it on prime agricultural land? What's access to roads and so on? What's its noise? In that regard as well. So there's not been an application in East Lothian as of yet. There's been discussed about, but not an application as yet. So the planning obviously will be decided by the local authority. So I've not seen the actual planning application as of yet for the one at Longford-Macus. I've had a discussion with the group, and I'll have another discussion with the group when there's more details kind of come forward. Scottish Government are looking to issue a guidance on this because it's probably an issue, to be honest with you, that's only come up in the last 3 or 4 months politically in terms of that. And I'm seeing colleagues across Scotland are having similar issues. So Scottish Government are looking at issuing planning guidance, but ultimately it'll be up to the councillors. And if it's Longford-Macus, it'll be in the borders. If it's in East Lothian, obviously councillors in East Lothian in terms of that as well. But Scottish Government's going to issue guidance in terms of what should be looked at. It's an issue that, as I said, it's only really come up in the last 3 or 4 months in terms of some of these data centres being proposed. but some aren't at the application stage, if you know what I mean. So it's difficult to actually assess an application until you see the full details.
It's sounds like a similar in a way similar to the parking charges because it's been it's been proposed and so local people didn't even know it's been proposed. It goes, these things get pushed through without any consultation or scrutiny, and the Lammermuir Hills are no safe scientific interest. That's been mural for the last 4,000 years, and it would be an absolute environmental travesty.
Yeah, there's
Catastrophe.
I think there's
And I find it hard to believe that there's not other brownfield sites, in and around the Lowlands that are better. We're talking about massive environmental.
Yeah. So yeah, because the two or three key issues. One, as I said, is about if it whether it's in prime agricultural land or brownfield sites, as you said. So that the council will look at that in terms of that. The two other environmental considerations, and you're quite right, is around about what is its energy use, where is it getting its energy use from? So I know, for example, in other parts of in Ireland, for example, they were using gas-powered generators to fund to power these, which is just completely silly in terms of that. So one of the key fundamentals is in terms of where did they get the energy from in terms of that. Now, there are some energy, obviously some of the, and I talked around about, for example, Scotland produces 115% more electricity than it actually needs. So is there an excess? But again, that would need to be depending on what part of Scotland that is. And the other key issue around about data centres is the use of cooling, and that's water. So where did they get the water from? So the fundamental questions that the council will be looking at, the Scottish Government's looking at as well, is how is the data centre going to be powered in terms of, and how is the data centre going to be cooled? And these are the things that the local authority will be looking at in terms of its planning. Now, some of these, there's a data centre being looked at and proposed in near Dunbar. I'm meeting the group that deal with that next month to talk about it. There is not a planning application in as of yet. So, there's nothing to oppose as of yet because there's not a planning application. Now, the planning application needs to be approved before it goes ahead. The planning application isn't going ahead. The developers need to engage with the community in terms of that. They can't bring this forward without engagement with the community. So again, that's something I will encourage all developers to do. That is engage with the local community this is going to impact on, and I will make sure that's doing. But I'm meeting the group that's been set up around about the Dunbar one, as I did with the Long Formicus one, to say, look, happy to engage with them, happy to talk to the applicants when there's more detail that's there. But it's an issue that's impacting all across Scotland and across the rest of the UK at the moment. So
I can't remember the figures off the top of my head, but the energy consumption is astronomical. It's just massive. And I've seen film on the internet the already roads and bridges in Lammermuir are being damaged by water lorries that are going up to the site and going up to the reservoir. And apparently the Borders Council have already said, oh, we're sorry, we don't have money to fix that. And it's just so not appropriate at all.
If and I know because we've obviously got, there's wind farms, onshore wind farms as well, and there's some work obviously going on about repowering these. There are, and I know this in terms of the engagement with the community council up there as well as the council itself. There are schemes that are put in place by the council to make sure that roads are repaired, and that the community council, to be fair with them, do work closely with the council to make sure that happens. So again, it's ensuring that the developers pay for any damage or repair any damage that they're doing over a period of time. And that already works really well. And around about Innerwick, for example, the community council are very closely follow that and make sure that there's repairs that are carried out. So,
and when I first heard about the proposed data center, my stomach churned. It did make me so unwell thinking about that beautiful, incredible part of the world and Moorland being trashed. And we're not talking about a small development, it's vast, it's like
So, as,
370 acre. It's
yeah, as I said, David, I met with them about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I'm planning to meet them again in the next 2 or 3 weeks.
okay.
Once there's more details, and they're pushing the developer for details, full details at this stage. Even though it's not in East Lothian, it is just over the border
Yes.
from East Lothian, so it's very close to East Lothian. But
Yeah.
I've met with them, and I'm planning to meet with, and we're trying to get a date agreed with those who are protesting against the proposed data centre in Dunbar, West Barnes area. So,
Yeah.
but we need to obviously see where the
Yeah.
actual proposals, when actual proposals come forward. We're not at that stage yet, but I've said, to developers, they need to engage with the communities in terms of
Yeah.
that. So we'll see how that develops
So
over a period of time. I don't think all these data centers will go ahead, because I think there's almost like it's a rush to try and build these data centers when someone, and I know, speaking to the proposal, the protesters in Longford, that the Roxburgh estate don't have an end user for that. So if they don't have an end user, then obviously it's not going to go ahead. But there's almost like a rush to try and look at the schemes to develop this. They won't all go ahead because there'll be too many proposals as against what's actually required. So we'll see how that pans out. But I'm keeping in close touch with both the Longford protesters and the Dunbar protesters as well. So.
well, that's it. Let's hope it don't go ahead and our natural and habitat will be preserved. That's what we thought there.
And another thing, David, you've probably seen it. I don't know if you've seen it last week. I had an article in the Courier asking people for their views on data centres,
Right, yeah.
and I think probably received around about 200 to 300 responses on that. So, because I wanted to find out what the views of people in East Lothian were, and I'll engage with groups once we know that these get to actual proposal stages. Actually an application going on. They're not at that stage as of yet, but I'll continue to engage with community groups on that issue.
Good, good. Oh, well, yeah, well, Paul, I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation today.
Me too, David. Me too.
We've covered all our ground. So thank you very much for your time. I'm really grateful and hopefully bump
Always a pleasure.
time. Hopefully bump into something soon.
Yes.
Okay.
David, good to see you.
Okay, you too. Thanks very much.
Cheers now. Bye. Bye.
Oh, that's good, Paul. Thank you.